Mineta and David Ono, who all of whom you met in the film, and Alice Takemoto and Paul, to talk a little bit about themselves, maybe a few minutes to give you a sense of what they sound like, and then if we could open this up. So, Shirley, if you would start.
Well, I'm Shirley Higuchi, and you've pretty much heard my story about Heart Mountain in the film. My commitment to my commitment to telling the story is really what was in the film, and that you know, my parents met there as children, but I was raised in the Midwest, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and my parents really never talked about that experience. And so I would get hints of the experience, learning things by following Norm's career and Senator Inouye's career and other distinguished leaders in our politics, which led me to come to Washington, D.C. and become a lawyer. But it's very difficult for my generation to speak about this experience because the Nisei, in many ways, were very quiet about it. So my goal with my foundation and with my leadership that's here in Washington, D.C. this week is to tell that story.
All of you saw the placards that were being put up on utility posts and sides of buildings. And it simply said, instructions to those of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien. And as a 10-year-old kid, I would look at that sign wondering, who's a non-alien? It's a citizen. But my own government wasn't willing to acknowledge me as a citizen. And that's why to this day, I cherish the word citizen, because my own government wasn't willing to recognize me as a citizen. Now, when's the last time that any of you stood up, beat your chest, and said, I am a proud non-alien of the United States of America? I don't think you have. But that's why the word citizen and the Constitution are so important, and that we must be vigilant in the protection of those constitutional rights. Not vigilantes, but vigilant in the protection of our constitutional rights.
My name is David Ono. I work in Los Angeles as a news anchor, and I get the opportunity to do a lot of different kinds of stories, but obviously I have an attachment to this one, being Japanese American. But my family they were not in the camps. My family is actually from Japan. But when I run across these kinds of stories, I truly believe these are some of the greatest stories in American history that so few of us know about. And so to have the opportunity to say this and talk about this to me is a real blessing. My thanks to Patty Hirohara for calling me that one day and telling me about this photo collection. Huge thanks to Shirley over here, because Shirley is one who put me on the track with just how dynamic and unbelievable these individual stories were out of this one camp. And just keep in mind, this is one of 10 camps and other facilities. And these stories are almost endless. Dynamic, amazing, tragic, triumphant stories that are endless when it comes to this generation. So it was a real privilege for me to be able to tell this story. I do want to point out, we did cut out 2 chapters for sake of time, but they're worth talking about just very briefly. And one of the more important ones is the fact that these Nisei soldiers from the 442nd, they have a division, 522nd Regimental Combat Team, or the 522nd Artillery Battalion. They helped liberate Dachau. And it was something that our government did not talk about for decades. But it's legitimate, it happened. It's a sense of pride for the members of the 142nd, but it's also a sense of shame for the fact that our government hid that, or allegedly didn't talk about that for several decades. And it's an important thing to note because we're coming along the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau. And so I think it's a very important part of American history that minorities were part of that liberation. In fact, there are a lot of other soldiers of color that were left out of that story as well. So that's something to keep in mind. But I'll let the experts here talk, but I just want to say it was a real privilege to be able to bring this story to our viewers. Alice told me she didn't expect her son pulled fast one on her and said, "Do you want to come with me?" I'm actually telling her, "You're actually going to talk." But you are wonderful. You're adorable. I can already tell.
I think David covered so much about Heart Mountain. I was in Arkansas, and when I think of what the people in Heart Mountain, how cold it was, can you imagine a day like this when you wanted to go have a drink of water or go to the bathroom? You had to go outside, and your barrack never got warm. When it was winter, even in Arkansas, we never got warm. And I just thought I'll put that out to you so you can kind of think what it was like.
I'm her son. I'm nervous. I feel very self-conscious being here. I find it very ironic that I should be participating in a day of remembrance when I spent so much of my life trying to forget the fact that I'm Japanese American and anything having to do with it. She was in camp in Arkansas, she said. My dad was from Hawaii. He was a combat medic with the 442nd, and they settled in Maryland after the war. So I was born and raised here. And I'm 57 now, and I think when you get older, you start to look respectable, but it's a very thin veneer. So the split screen would be me with long hair and a flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off, you know, living life like an extra in a Cheech and Chong movie. Pride. I'm proud now to be Japanese American. It's come very late. I was in a slavery museum with my wife, and came across a quote by Nelson Mandela, and he said, I'm paraphrasing this, but he said something to the effect of, "I'm ashamed of being shamed." And that's where I am.
This was not like herding cats. You all were splendid in keeping this very short, but also something very personal, and I think that is really a wonderful thing. You know, I will do as I promised, which is not usual. And that is to open this up now to the audience, because I'm sure you'll have. We have two sets of microphones on the different aisles, and we have our wonderful volunteers, Krishna and Krista Aniel. Which one is Krista? They're twins. Krista,
Hi, Krishna.
That's Krista. Which one are you?
Krishna.
Krishna and Krista. Krista is at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and Krishna is at the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian. They're both wonderful participants at the Asian Pacific American Center when I was fortunate enough to have been there. So I want to thank David, Allison, and Noriko Sanefuji, and Magdalena, and Cami, and all the people here at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History for having provided this venue for us this evening. And as I say, if you would line up at the mic, oh, are you taking microphones around? Terrific. Okay, if you raise your hands to ask questions or make comments, and if you have comments, make them short. Thank you.
Hi,
And identify yourself.
my name is Karen DeGeese, and I'm from Bethesda, Maryland. And I have a very simple question to ask. The man who had the photo lab, it said that it was hidden. What were the consequences if it would have been found? And were people at Heart Mountain ever maltreated?
Patty, would you take that, please? This is the granddaughter, right? Who was in the film.
Yes, I'm Patty Hirahara. And I think I was talking to somebody from the National Archives today. And I would really like to find out what's in my family's folder. But in looking at the final report of Heart Mountain, it didn't show how many times my family went in and out of camp. It didn't show about the car that they purchased. My grandfather purchased a car when he was farming in Nisei, Oregon, and he brought it back to Heart Mountain, and they let him keep it. So I think, in retrospect, that they probably knew. But because they were doing it for a good purpose, that they were doing it for record keeping, I think that's why it was allowed to stay.
Pretty interesting.
I'm Jim McCallum. I just want to thank you all so much for that just really wonderful presentation. And the movie is so profound. I think it really, I'm sure you're doing all you can, but let us know, any of us, what we can do to have it shown more widely in our local schools, at our federal agencies during this month, or anything at all. I mean, that movie, it's pretty spectacular, and everybody should see the entire thing.
Thank you very much.
I have one more comment, and Secretary Mineta, I'm sure many of us have heard you tell the story, but aren't you going to tell us about that vicious weapon at your feet?
You have to do that.
Well, when I was being evacuated on May 29th, 1942, I was in my Cub Scout uniform, baseball glove, and a bat. And as I got on the train, the bat was taken by the MPs saying, you can't take a bat on board. Well, I went running, crying to my father, and he said, that's all right, we'll get it replaced sometime, but don't fuss over it. When we got to Santa Anita, no baseball bats were available, but I don't know if any of you have ever tried hitting a baseball with a piece of stick. It just stings in your hand, and it taught me a lesson not to play baseball with a piece of stick. You had to have a bat with it. But in 2 years ago, I guess it was, after I had done a 3-day videotape of my time in President George W. Bush's cabinet, the archivist and curator for the George W. Bush Library, in thank you to me for the 3 days of videotaping, sent me this bat. And it is really a Louisville Slugger with a cane handle on top and the rubber bottom, and I use it every day. Now, I can't carry it on the airplane. And the day I got this bat, the next day, my wife and I were going down to Hot Springs, Arkansas, to meet with President Clinton, and the TSA said, can't take the bat on there. And I said, well, it's my cane. And my wife said, you made the rules.
I know Denny Mineta has been an extremely staunch supporter of the good things that Secretary Mineta has done. So I wonder if you would just stand for a second and be acknowledged. Thank you. Okay, next.
Franklin, I'd like to answer for the gentleman in terms of what he can do, or what all of you can do to help this film. There's a postcard outside, and on the back says, please like us on Facebook. If all of you that have access to Facebook, if you can add your likes to this will really help this film. Thank you.
Great idea. Here? Yes.
Yes, my question is this.
Can you tell us who you are?
Hi, my name is Omoja Sumler. As we all know, Japan was allied with Germany and Italy. And my question is this. As descendants of people that were interred, how do you feel about the fact that German Americans and Italian Americans were not also interred?
Good question.
Well, I think that's the part about Executive Order 9066 that's so significant, because the wording in the executive order did not talk about rounding up potential spies or saboteurs or whomever. It just delegated to the commanding general of the Western Civil Defense Command the authority to use Executive Order 9066. And General DeWitt figured if the Japanese could attack Hawaii, they would probably be able to attack the west coast of the United States. And it was within his jurisdiction of the 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry who were living there. And his thought was, if they invade the west coast, the Japanese Americans will join with the military forces from Japan. And that was a given for him, because the other very famous quote of his was, once a Jap, always a Jap. So you couldn't make the distinction of a German American and Italian American, but being of Japanese ancestry, it was pretty evident. And there were many people, friends, who wore pins. I am a Chinese American, because they didn't want to be all of a sudden picked up for whatever reason. So it's one in which there is really no answer, except that by ethnicity and by identity, we were easily rounded up.
Hi, my name is Tara Ortman. I'm a former intern with the Japanese American Citizens League. I know at least a few of you on the stage, so hello. And I had a question. First of all, thank you so much for bringing the documentary here tonight. I think one of the things that I like so much about it is the fact that it is very vignette and centered around people's experiences, individuals' experiences. It's not the typical narrative that takes you from 1941 to 1945 and then maybe to 1988. But I think my question now is, this is obviously being shown at a number of JACL events, I know, at Day of Remembrance events, but how often have you, Mr. Ono, how often have you been able to show it outside of the immediate Japanese American community? And what kinds of responses have you gotten there from people who maybe don't know the historical arc that many of us know from our families, from history textbooks if we're lucky, etc.?
Right. That's a question for Shirley, I think.
Oh, well, I'm sure David has a response. Well, I think it has had wide exposure outside of the Japanese American community. I mean, LA, it aired publicly. But go ahead.
Well, Tara, good to see you again. She helped get the JACL to kind of spread this around. I think the answer is not such good news, to be honest. It has received a lot of attention across the country, but almost all the venues, except for this one, are Japanese American related. In Seattle, in San Jose, San Francisco, Los Angeles, of course. I did a thing in Houston, but that was also attached to the Houston Asian Society Museum. So it's very positive, the fact that this is getting a lot of attention and it's been spread around. Like when we aired it in Los Angeles last year in May, I think. And we thought that would be it. And then it seems to have had a life of its own, which is very encouraging. But when we do get requests to show it, it's almost always a Japanese American group. But the positive part of that is they always bring in people of other ethnicities who have a great deal to say about it. And inevitably, like this really kind gentleman over here, teachers come forward and say, I need copies because I want to show it in my classrooms because it's a chapter that's not talked about. And if it is talked about, it's not talked about enough. So we do all we can to supply whatever teachers from middle school, high school, into college. A lot of universities, though, I do take that back. Universities have shown it, which is very, very positive. But as we often say, a quote that we have is, we are often, when we show this, preaching to the choir. The people who show up are often people who know the story and know it's a dynamic story and want to also help spread the story, but they know the story. You know, we need to find the people, young people, all ethnicities, who want to watch this story. So it's a great question, and it's one that we are still grappling with today.
I think we may start seeing a shift with that, David, because we had gotten a call from the Department of Navy. I don't know what they call it, but they said, you know, we want to show it to our military forces and we can get exposure to like 900 people. I doubt a lot of those folks are going to be Asian American. And I think a lot of it is it's going to take some time. But I even know, being a lawyer in Washington, D.C., I speak to my colleagues, and a lot of them don't even know about the internment, which I find to be very shocking if you're a lawyer. That's almost, crazy to think about it. So I think it's just going to take time, I think, and I think there's going to be a period where everyone will know about this issue and be able to identify it with it, and that's my hope.
You have a mic?
Yeah. I'm Shukoyoshi Kami, and I was in Heart Mountain. And it had two things. One was they showed the Boy Scouts, but there were the Girl Scouts. And,
That would be in part 2. That's a good point. I never even thought of
answer
that.
the question, why weren't the Germans and the Italian Americans rounded up? That's because clearly, you can't identify them with the majority. But basically, that's been not discussed very much is the economic issue in this of Japanese Americans and Japanese couldn't own property in California. They couldn't purchase property, so they bought it in the names of their neighbor or their children. And this enmity goes back into the 20s or even earlier. So I think that's an underlying issue it adds to. It's more than just a racial issue, but it's an economic issue. And I think the Jews know about this in Europe.
Thank you. I think that's a good point. I mean, there's follow the money sometimes leads you to some really interesting conclusions. So we have, I heard a little bit of the microphones. There's somebody over here. Somebody in the back there first.
Hi, I'm Nadia Izumi Marquez, and my grandfather was interned both at Tule Lake and Gila River. And when you ask him about his experiences, he often says, this is war, it's what expected. And there really isn't an ongoing conversation on educating the Nisei and Sansei on those experiences in those camps, and how best to make sure that we can propagate the story so that history isn't repeated, and more importantly, that history isn't forgotten. So my question is what can we do as Sansei and future generations do to really ensure that this history lives on?
Well, I mean, that's the big project that we're working on right now, is to engage the younger generation. And I'll tell you, it's not easy, especially when you weren't taught about it as a kid. But I think what you could do is, when I have this thing of adopting a Nisei, kind of like, really take ownership over one or two people or three people that experienced this, and really went through hell. I mean, I think somebody had asked here about, was there any abuse or maltreatment? Of course they were abused. They were in a prison. There was a gun facing the inward in the camp. My mother had her appendix out with what kind of sanitary stuff? You know what I'm saying? So obviously it was abusive. And we looked, at my mother's files that were at the archives, and just the sort of the notations by the counselors and the teachers there, some of the remarks were pretty much inappropriate things you shouldn't be saying about children. So it's just very interesting, but I believe that if one young person just adopts the story of 3 or 4 and promise to tell that story, then that would make a big difference.
If I could add to that, there's such an advantage today than there was when I was young. Cameras and edit equipment and all of this stuff were like so expensive, and now we have cameras and recording equipment on our cell phones. So I think that generation did not talk, notoriously did not talk. That's almost what everybody says when they were growing up, is my parents never told me anything about this. But the ones that are left, if young people can record them, that would be invaluable, because they're not going to be around forever. And their own individual circumstances and experience could be priceless, and especially to you. So Jeff and I, my co-producer on this, we always encourage the young people when we talk to your classroom and stuff like that. You now have the wherewithal to record whatever you want to record. Sit somebody down that you respect, who has a history, and talk to them about it, and keep it forever before you lose the opportunity to do so.
This question, Frank, about why isn't there more discussion about it? I think because of the, I guess you might say, the cultural or the psychological side of the Japanese American community. You don't like to talk about things that are bad. So to me, the yoke of shame was put on those of Japanese ancestry on the signing of Executive Order 9066. And they never wanted to talk about it. And yet, I'd like to think that on August 10th, 1988, when President Reagan signed the HR 442 into law, that recognition of the gross violation of the rights of 120,000 people, that yoke of shame was somehow lifted off their shoulders at that point. And as I said, the most poignant part of the law to me was that the Congress, on behalf of the American people, apologizes to those of Japanese descent for the gross violation of their constitutional rights.
That's a really good point. I've been reminded that the Congress of the United States has apologized 5 times. Probably should have apologized many more times than that, but it has nonetheless apologized 5 times. Once for, in a brief mention of slavery, another time for mistreatment of Native Americans, a 3rd time for the unconstitutional overthrow of the Native Hawaiian Kingdom, a 4th time for the passage of the Chinese exclusion law and the exclusion acts that obtained thereafter, and a 5th time for the treatment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And it's the only time that an apology came with money, you know, with redress, reparations of some kind, to indicate that there was some wrong that had been inflicted on a target population. But I wanted to ask Paul to, you know, talking about how his book, by the way, is out for sale. And I think you should insist that he go out there and sign these books, because he's been recalcitrant. And, I don't seem to be able to convince him to do that on my own. So if you would all applaud. And embarrassing if you're going out there. His book, Nisei Memories, is an extraordinary work about what it takes for someone in the family to get to the point to say he's a skilled writer and has been in communications stuff forever, so he knows how to write. That is one of the skill sets that he brought to bear. But maybe you can talk a little bit about what brought you to the point where you could talk to your parents and actually try to set their stories down on paper.
Well, I mean, the reason why I'm recalcitrant is that I didn't set out to write a book. Basically, what happened is that I knew that my mom was in a camp, and I knew that my dad was in the 442nd. And these 2 facts were just sort of backdrops to my life, which for much of my youth was spiraling downward. But what happened was that at the dedication of the memorial here in the year 2000, she said, they're going to dedicate a memorial, do you want to go? And I, up until that point, and so this is pretty recently, I pretty much resisted anything like that. And I had an image of my head of the Kobayashis and the Nishis and the Ikaris and a half dozen other Japanese American families that we know, sitting on folding chairs while they unveil a plaque somewhere. And we went over to the monument site. I was with a couple buddies from work, non-Japanese Americans, and there were thousands and thousands of people there. And just seeing so many people there for that reason was really amazing to me. And that night, we were sitting in a chicken out on Rockville Pike, and my dad was talking about all the people he knew on that wall, all the friends of his who'd been killed. There were about 22 of them. And then I just asked if he wouldn't mind talking about these things, and I went over the next day with a tape recorder. But none of this captures the awkwardness of, I mean, there is no way to get entree into these conversations in the normal course of your life. You know, you go over on a Saturday afternoon and your dad just comes in from mowing the lawn and your mom's there and you say, you know, I want to hear what happened to you during the war. That pretty much guarantees it's going to be a short conversation. So, my only advice is, because you're not going to find an entree to these conversations, you have to manufacture one. You really have to, it will seem really contrived because it doesn't fit in with anything else that you have in that relationship with that person. Like my father and I had a very, I mean, he disowned me a couple times. She used to drag me through the house by the ankle so she could shove a bar of soap in my mouth.
This is more information than as far as your mom is concerned.
But the one point that I wanted to talk about shame is that I never understood why they didn't want to talk about it until we were actually talking about it, and my mom said that she always blamed herself for that. She thought that, well, if the government did this, there must be a good reason for it. We must, you know, there must be something wrong with us. And that's when I first started to understand the shame behind not wanting to talk about it.
Yeah, you know, there's somebody over here, but when the JCL first got involved in addressing this whole issue in the early 1970s, it was Edison Uno, a lone, sort of solitary voice who spurred a lot of the rest of us on to try to confront the injustice of it all. And the way he analyzed the silence that had ensued between 1945 and 1970, long time, you know, was to analogize the Japanese Americans to victims of rape. And until at least very recently, the propensity of the society to make the victims feel that they had somehow been responsible for inviting the assault. Too short a dress, too drunk demeanor, too whatever, you know, and to make the victim feel responsible for the obscenity. So yeah, I think you know actually contriving a way, even though it may seem artificial, is something that's necessary to do. Over here.
Hi, first of all, my name is Bob Mathis. I'm a high school history teacher. I want to commend and applaud the filmmaker and all of you for being here. This is an important story. It's more than 9066. It's about human rights, civil rights, and that message is so important. And my one suggestion, Shirley, is to contact the National Council of Social Studies Teachers. We are part of the answer, or the solution, I should say, towards getting this word out. I can tell you Montgomery County, this film will be shown, at least in my class.
We actually talked about that at our board meeting today with the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation, and we're actually bringing a high school teacher who teaches on the East Coast on our board to add diversity, and we hope that that's a project. The other thing is, Sam Mihara, who was also a prisoner and part of our board now, is available for speaking engagements. And we need a pretty large crowd to make that happen, but for instance, if all the, you know, DC, Greater Washington schools want to have a forum, that's something that Sam could think about doing for even Asian American Month or something of that nature. So keep that in mind too.
Very good. Okay, there's another hand here. Okay, go ahead.
Many of us are graduates of Oberlin College.
Can you
and of
identify
course,
this?
John
Who are
Salzberg.
you?
John Salzberg.
Okay.
And of course, we're proud that Oberlin had a number of Japanese Americans that they had, including Alice. And Alice, I wondered if you might talk a little bit about how you were received by the college and by the students.
You should tell them why you went there.
overwhelming. And I passed all the music classes because that's, you know, that music is what I did all my life. But I had to take a college course each year, one subject, and that was torture. and there was never anything unpleasant. The students, they weren't friendly, and I was very small, very small, scared too, and I didn't speak up, and so I really felt like an outsider for my whole 4 years there. People were very, the teachers, they helped me out, and I did well as a music student. But I think if I were to go back there now, I would really make more of it. But it was.
Go ahead, man.
Another thing too. Oberlin was such a liberal arts college, and being in the conservatory, you're just focused on one thing. But some of that rubbed off on me, and I'm very grateful for that.
Also, I think we owe a great deal of credit to the Quakers. They formed a Friends Service Committee to find students who were in the camps and get them relocated to campuses that were willing to accept Japanese American students. And Oberlin was one of the favorite schools that people went to. But you'll find that they were mostly church-oriented, Ohio Wesleyan, Connecticut Wesleyan, Drew University in New Jersey, and a lot of other schools that started out as from a religious orientation. But it was the Friends Service Committee that really got thousands of students out of the camps and into universities during World War II.
Right, but not all religions. The Quakers were pretty unusual.
Yeah. Oh, the reason I chose Oberlin was that Kenji Okuda was a Nisei, who was the student body president. And I had other places that I considered, but when I heard that really made my decision. It was a friendly place. And that was very important to me.
All right. Okay.
When I went to school, 1943.
Okay, there's a question here. Somebody, go ahead.
I'm Maureen Kawano-Hinkle, and I thought that just for the record that it would be useful for people to know that Italians and Germans were incarcerated, and they were picked up, in fact, minutes after the bombs landed on Pearl Harbor, because the FBI agents, working from lists of thousands of people already compiled in their secret custodial detention index, and they arrested that quickly an estimated 2,000 Japanese and German immigrants on the west and east coasts. 14 days later, they arrested 1,430 Japanese, 1,153 Germans, and 215 Italians in the continental US and Hawaii. And I think that many people don't know that Germans and Italians were also targeted, and to my knowledge have not had an apology.
Yeah, no, that is true, and I thank you very much for bringing that up. One of the differences, though, is that those people of Italian or German descent who were picked up were all hearings, as were all the people in Hawaii. Their families were, there were American-born German Italians, German Americans or Italian Americans who were incarcerated, and then in some cases deported, sent to homeland of their parents, country which they did not know, and which where they were not welcome because they were thought of as Americans, and they're therefore possibly spies or agents or whatever. So there were individual cases where this was a very difficult thing for them, and yeah, I think they deserve an apology as well. Yes, is it back there? Okay, go ahead.
My parents were interned in Arkansas, and
okay, and who are you?
My name is Mary Ishimoto Morris, and my question is, I was really, I only recently learned, because my parents also didn't talk a lot about their experience, about the resistors. And I'm sorry that I didn't know about them earlier, but so I was really happy to see that they were in this documentary. But I was wondering, for those of you who were in had the camp experience, my father has passed and I can't ask him. I was wondering, did your perception change viewing them as unpatriotic, and now you're seeing them as patriotic? That's just...
This is a norm question, I think. You know, wasn't it really difficult to get over? I mean, the JCL, for example, really took off after the resistors and the no-no boys, and then you were extremely helpful in getting the leadership of the JCL to sort of change its tune on this.
Well, I suppose I could say, next question. But there was, of course, at Hard Mountain with the, there were some 85, but I think 73 went to prison. There was a great deal of animosity towards the 73 at the time, because at the same time they were trying to recruit people out of the military, out of the camps, to join the 100th and the 442nd. Now the 100th was the 100th Battalion from Hawaii, and the 100th became the 1st Battalion of the 442nd. So there were a number of battalions, but the 100th was one of the battalions. And I remember Dan Inouye used to always tell me at Camp Shelby about how they got into fights between the mainlanders and the Hawaii boys. And they took a trip to Arkansas to visit one of the camps. And on the way they'd play ukuleles and sing their songs. And then when they got to the camps, they couldn't believe that here's this camp surrounded by barbed wire, and then each of the soldiers going in had to be identified, and so they got to stay in the camp for that Saturday, Sunday, and they went on back to Camp Shelby. Dan always said, on the way back, there was no singing, there was no conversation going on, except wondering, why would anyone who's behind barbed wire in this circumstance volunteer to become a member of the 100th or the 442nd or the Military Intelligence Service? And I think that there was this animosity between the quote war resistors and those who volunteered and went into the military. But now that we reflect on it, then we see that this was another way people were advocating in terms of the violation of their constitutional rights. So I think now there is a recognition about where the 73 and what happened to them, and that they must be recognized for what they did. I know in talking to my friend Alan Simpson, he said, you know, I don't know if I would have ever volunteered for the military if I was sitting in that camp. So again, it's another facet of loyalty to country, and it was just done in two different ways, still meaning the same thing as we reflect on those veterans who did resist. I don't think we have to put them into a hero status, but equal recognition about what they were doing.
Paul, yeah.
Yeah, for what it's worth, my dad, as I said, volunteered from Hawaii and was a combat medic. He felt that the resistors, he always called them heroes. He felt that what they did was more heroic than what he did by volunteering for the Army. He said, I was just going along with everybody. And I have always felt that the resistors issue is central to understanding the Japanese-American experience, because it speaks to the best and the worst of the Japanese-American experience. You have these men who did more to stand up directly for their constitutional rights at that time, and they were ostracized by their own community, which is a point of shame in our past. So I firsthand am proud of those guys and identify with what they did.
Very good point. We have time for one more question.
Last question.
Okay.
My turn. Hi, I'm Sam Mihara. Thanks a lot, Shirley, for introducing me. I was a prisoner at Heart Mountain. I was 9 years old and came out at 12. And I've been asked to give a lot of talks. In fact, I've gone maybe over 10,000 students and teachers so far. And somebody brought up the question about was there brutality at Heart Mountain. We did not see the degree of brutality we had at some of the other camps, but it was in a form of a more subtle type. And my father, for example, went blind at Heart Mountain because the government would not let him go out of the camp to see a specialist he used to see in California. It was denial of good medical practice. My grandfather died in camp of cancer, real severe, painful cancer. And I checked his medical records and found out that he wasn't being mistreated in camp. But the main point, of course, is, what's the lesson learned out of all of this? And when I give speeches to the classes, we're talking about history teachers, and I'll be going very frequently over the next year. There's a way to get help if you want some good qualified people who speak, and that is to go to your local JACL office or chapter. And you can find them easily in the website under JACL, but they maintain typically a roster of people who can speak to the topic of imprisonment. And I encourage you to do that and try to find somebody who has had experience and let them tell you the real facts about what they remembered about what happened, or their parents or grandparents may have told them about what happened. I think that would be a good approach to solving the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let me ask to have this part of the program draw to a close and ask all of you to help me thank our panelists.